The curtains are drawn, the candle is burning low on the bedside table. There is a woman in the bed, and she is not quite what she appears. Hello and welcome. Welcome back to Sleep History with Sikandar. I'm genuinely glad you're here tonight, wherever you are, in whatever corner of the world this finds you. We're going to spend this evening inside a story that most history books tend to skip past. It is a story about illness and power and the extraordinary ingenuity of women who had almost nothing to work with, and at the centre of it is a bedroom. Because here is the thing about the Victorian era. We know its rigid social rules. We know its corsets, its propriety, its silences. We know what women couldn't do, couldn't own property, couldn't vote, couldn't refuse. But we talk less often about what they could do. And one of the things they could do, under very specific circumstances, was take to their bed. Not as a surrender, not as a defeat, as a strategy. A quiet, brilliant, socially sanctioned strategy that their husbands, their doctors, and even the church couldn't easily challenge. Because a sick woman was, within the rules of Victorian society, a protected woman. She couldn't be asked to host a dinner. She couldn't be required to attend a ball. She couldn't be made to receive morning callers, manage servants, smile at her mother-in-law, or fulfill the duties that Victorian marriage considered non-negotiable. She was, in the most literal sense, off-duty. And off-duty, in a world where women were never supposed to be off-duty, was a very powerful thing. Here is what most people don't know about the Victorian invalid. She wasn't always sick, and when she wasn't, she was sometimes extraordinary. Tonight, we're going to go inside that world. The sick room, the diagnosis, the medicine, the women who turned one of history's most limiting spaces into something else entirely. Florence Nightingale ran an empire from her bed. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote her finest poetry in a room she compared to a prison. And hundreds of thousands of ordinary women, whose names we'll never know, used the simple, quiet language of illness to say the one word their society refused to let them say out loud. No. Now, before we go any further, I have a habit, late at night, when everything is quiet and the house is still. I open the comments. I don't entirely know why. It's become a ritual I'm slightly embarrassed to admit to. But the comments I keep coming back to are the ones that have a place and a time in them. Someone in a bedroom at 2 a.m, someone on a couch in a city I've never visited. They make the whole thing feel less like a video and more like, I don't know, company. So if you have a moment tonight, tell me where you are and what time it is there. I'd genuinely love to know. And if this kind of storytelling makes your evenings a little slower and a little richer, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. It helps more than you probably realize. Now, dim those lights if you haven't already. Let the room get a little quieter around you. There is a candle burning low on a bedside table, somewhere in England in the 1870s. The curtains are drawn against the afternoon light. Let everything else fall away. We're going in. It is the 1870s. If you are a woman in England, a married woman of the middle or upper classes, your life runs on a single organizing principle. This principle has a legal name. It is called Coverture. Under Coverture, when you marry, your legal identity is absorbed into your husband's. You do not exist as an independent person under the law. You cannot own property in your own name. You cannot enter into contracts, conduct legal business, or sue on your own behalf. The money you had before the marriage becomes his. The furniture your mother left you becomes his. The jewellery, the savings, the small investments, all of it. On the day you say your vows, you cease, legally speaking, to be a separate person. This is not a fringe condition. This is the law of England until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 begin, slowly and only partially to change it. And even then, the change takes decades to feel real in ordinary lives. For most Victorian women, for most of the Victorian era, the marriage contract means something very specific. You're one person, legally speaking, and that person is your husband. But the legal situation is only the beginning. The social situation is, if anything, more demanding still. In 1854, a poet named Coventry Patmore published a sequence of poems called The Angel in the House. The title catches on with remarkable speed, because it names something people already instinctively feel. The ideal Victorian wife, the angel, is self-sacrificing, cheerful, endlessly patient, and entirely without needs of her own. She does not complain. She does not demand. She exists, the poem suggests, to smooth the lives of the people around her and to ask nothing in return. This is not a literary exaggeration. Victorian household management manuals are extremely specific about what is expected. A middle-class wife manages several servants, each requiring daily instruction and supervision. She oversees the family's social calendar with the precision of a professional secretary. She receives morning callers, a formal practice that runs for several hours most days. She plans the meals, manages the household accounts, handles all the family correspondence. She educates the children or supervises those who do. And she is expected to be gracious, present, and attentive to her husband's needs from the moment he wakes until the moment he sleeps. There is no official day off. There is no sick leave. There is no mechanism within the rules of polite Victorian society for a wife to simply say, "I cannot do this today. I'm exhausted. I need to stop." Except one. Let's put you there for a moment. It is a Tuesday in October. You are the wife of a solicitor, a respectable household, 2 servants, 3 children. You wake before 7. The cook needs instructions. The housekeeper has a question about the linen order. A tradesman has sent a bill that needs checking against the accounts. Your husband has social letters that require replies. Social correspondence is the wife's domain, not his. The children need your attention before their lessons begin. By 11, you are dressed to receive callers. Visitors may arrive any time between 11 and 1. This practice is called making morning calls, and despite the name, it happens in the late morning to early afternoon. The visits last 15 to 20 minutes each. You discuss nothing of substance. You smile. You offer tea. You perform the quiet, precise social choreography of a woman who has everything under control. Think for a moment about what those morning calls actually required of you. You receive a woman you may not particularly like for 15 minutes in your own drawing room. The conversation is conducted in a register of elaborate studied pleasantness. You do not say what you think. You do not say how you feel. You navigate the unspoken hierarchies of who called first, who sat where, whether the refreshments were adequate, and then you do it again. On a busy day in the social season, you might receive 5 or 6 callers. On a particularly trying day, more. And the season never quite ends. There's a formal London season, roughly May to August, that governs the social calendar of the upper classes with something like military precision. But middle-class society runs its own quieter version of the same schedule all year round. There is always something to attend, something to organise, someone to receive, someone to visit. The machinery of respectable Victorian social life runs constantly. It ran on women's time, women's labour, and women's endless, unpaid, unacknowledged effort. After the callers leave, there is luncheon. After luncheon, correspondence. After correspondence, perhaps a carriage call to return. Another drawing room, another 15 minutes, more tea. By evening, you're expected to be fresh and attentive when your husband comes home. You listen to his day. You don't burden him with yours, because his day involved real work, and yours, though it consumed every waking hour, was domestic management. Which doesn't quite count. There is something quietly arresting about this when you look at it from the outside. This is not a lazy life. This is not a simple life. It is a relentlessly demanding life, performed without pay, without recognition, without legal personhood, and without an official end. A Victorian wife was never off duty, not on Sundays, not in summer, not when she was tired or sad or angry or simply spent. There was no socially sanctioned, respectable mechanism for stopping, and yet, here is the part that genuinely surprises people. There was a way out. It wasn't public and it wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve confrontation or argument or any of the things that polite Victorian society found so distressing. It was a private, domestic, almost invisible strategy, and its name was illness. A woman who was simply unhappy had no recourse. A woman who was simply tired had no recourse. A woman who was depressed, overstretched, resentful, or quietly furious had no recourse, at least none that the social world would recognize. But a woman who was ill, a woman who had been declared ill by herself or her doctor, and who had visibly, demonstrably taken to her bed, she was exempt from all of it. The social obligations, the household duties, the morning calls, the dinner parties, the obligations to smile and serve and manage and perform. All of it could be suspended indefinitely, without scandal, without judgment, and without any requirement to explain or justify herself. Because the rules of Victorian sympathy were very clear on one point. You did not ask a sick woman to do things. You left her to rest, not noisily, not dramatically. With a headache that arrived slowly during breakfast and grew steadily worse, until by mid-morning the household understood that today would be different. Today she was not well. And today, quietly, without argument, the machinery of her obligations would have to manage itself. And she did. The interesting thing about illness as a social strategy is that it didn't require dishonesty in any simple sense. Victorian women were not, by and large, cynical fakers lying in bed eating bonbons while their households worried downstairs. The picture most people carry of a manipulative woman cleverly deceiving a gullible husband misses almost everything important about what was actually happening. The situation was considerably more complicated than that, and considerably more interesting. Here is what you have to understand about how the Victorians understood the female body. They believed quite sincerely that women were constitutionally more susceptible to illness than men, not as an insult, as received medical wisdom. A woman's nervous system was simply more sensitive than a man's. Her physical health was intimately connected to her emotional state in ways that men's was not. A woman who felt overwhelmed, or overworked, or quietly unhappy wasn't imagining things. By the medical standards of the time, she was physiologically at risk. Her very sensitivity, the same sensitivity that supposedly made her unfit for professional life, also made illness entirely credible. This created a situation that was, to put it mildly, unusual. The same doctors who used women's delicacy to justify excluding them from education and professional life. Those same doctors had, without quite intending to, made illness entirely plausible for anyone paying attention. The husbands believed it. Society believed it. The etiquette books confirmed it in writing. which meant that a woman who chose to believe it too, and acted accordingly, was not exactly lying. She was taking the medical establishment at their word, which, to be fair, is a completely reasonable response to the medical establishment. The Victorian medical establishment, it should be said, had opinions about almost everything. It had opinions about what women should eat, how they should sleep, and what they should read. It had opinions about their uteruses, specific, confident opinions, and about the relationship between those uteruses and their mental states. Some of those opinions were genuinely useful, most were not, but they were held with great conviction and written down in many books. And that conviction was ultimately why, when a woman said she was unwell, the world around her invariably believed her. The system had a further quietly ironic dimension. A woman who maintained a condition of invalidism somewhat beyond its strict medical necessity wasn't operating outside Victorian norms. She was operating entirely within them. The Victorians expected women to be delicate. The doctors confirmed it. The novels celebrated it. A woman of sensitivity was supposed to suffer, aesthetically, gently, in a way that displayed her refinement. To be occasionally prostrated by nerves was not a failing. In certain circles it was almost an accomplishment, which created a situation with a certain quiet genius to it. What this looked like in practice was a spectrum. At one end, the woman who is genuinely ill, real fever, real pain, a real condition that confines her to bed. No calculation involved. She is simply sick. At the other end, the woman who is perfectly healthy. She finds herself entirely unable to face a particular dinner party, or a particular evening performing cheerfulness for people she finds insufferable. She develops by 8 o'clock a headache. It is a very conveniently timed headache, and in the middle, where most of the interesting history lives, are the women who are genuinely unwell in ways that can't be separated from the conditions of their lives, genuinely exhausted, genuinely anxious, genuinely depleted by the unending performance of Victorian womanhood. Their illness is real in every way that matters. It is also simultaneously useful. These two things are not contradictions, they are in fact the same thing. Victorian etiquette around the sick room wasn't vague social custom. It was published guidance, household management manuals, etiquette books, medical guides about how to behave around an unwell woman. And what the guidance established, clearly and without ambiguity, was a specific set of rules. You did not disturb her. You did not bring household problems to her attention. You did not discuss business or social news or anything that might require her to engage her mind more than strictly necessary. If she was well enough to eat, her meals were brought to her room. If she was well enough to receive a brief visit, visitors would be admitted in whispers. If she was not well enough, they would not be admitted at all. A visitor to a sick room was expected to arrive silently, stay briefly, and speak in a low voice. She was not to discuss her own health. She was not to bring gossip or news of any kind that might prove agitating. She was to arrive, express sympathy in a murmur, leave a card, and withdraw. Some etiquette manuals specified that a visit of 10 minutes was the absolute maximum. Some suggested 5, which, as social calls go, must have been something of a relief for everyone involved. Victorian society also had an entire vocabulary of flowers. Floriography, it was called. Bouquets sent to a sick room were carefully chosen to avoid communicating something unintended. A well-meaning visitor who sent the wrong arrangement might inadvertently suggest undying passion, or grief, or something considerably more complicated than sympathy for a headache. Careful navigation was required. which is a sentence that applies to nearly every social exchange in the Victorian era, but in the case of sickroom bouquets, applies with particular precision. The invalid, for her part, could control who entered. She could send word through a servant that she was too unwell to receive any visitors at all, including the ones she found most tedious. The caller would receive this message with appropriate sympathy, leave their card with the footman, and go away. Compare that to the healthy woman situation. A healthy woman who refused a morning caller without good reason risked being considered rude and socially negligent. An unwell woman who sent the same caller away was simply doing what her condition required. Refusing company was practically medicinal. Her duty was to rest, and rest, for once, was a duty that suited her perfectly. This particular freedom wasn't equally available to all women. The sickroom as a strategy worked best for women of the middle and upper classes. These were women whose households had enough servants to continue functioning in their absence, whose husbands had enough income to be indulgent of their nerves, whose social world expected a degree of feminine delicacy as a marker of refinement. A working-class woman could not afford to be ill. The factory floor did not recognize headaches. The laundry did not pause for nervous exhaustion. The children still needed feeding, the rent still came due, and no servant would manage things in her absence. For a woman without that cushion, illness wasn't a strategy, it was a catastrophe. The sickroom as refuge was, like most refugees in Victorian society, most available to those who already had the most. For the women who could access it, though, it offered something genuinely unusual. The Victorian woman's ordinary life was performed almost entirely in public, or in the semi-public space of the household. Every room had its social function, its etiquette, its expectations. The drawing room was for company, the dining room was for family performance. Even the bedroom, strictly speaking, was a shared marital space. But the declared sickroom changed its nature the moment a woman took to her bed in it. It became private. It became hers. The social contract that governed every other room in the house simply did not apply beyond that door. And there was one dimension of this that historians have noted with particular care. Victorian marriage was, legally and socially, a contract that included obligations the law recognized. A wife had essentially no formal mechanism to decline them. But a doctor who had declared a woman's nerves to be in a delicate state would often advise that she not be unduly taxed. And what counted as undue tax, in the Victorian medical imagination, included precisely the obligations that couldn't otherwise be negotiated. It was not a perfect solution. Very few things available to Victorian women were perfect solutions, but for many it was the most useful one on offer. A headache that arrived reliably on difficult evenings, a nervous condition that flared exactly when it needed to, a quiet retreat behind a closed door into a room that ran on her schedule, the curtains at the angle she preferred, the candle burning at its own pace. The world on the other side required to wait. The sickroom, when it worked, was the one room in the Victorian house that truly belonged to the woman inside it. Now let me take you there. It is a grey October afternoon. You're standing at the door of a bedroom in a respectable English house, London perhaps, or a quieter street in a provincial town. The door is closed. A servant stands nearby who will ask your purpose before allowing you through. Your voice will need to drop almost immediately to something just above a whisper. Your visit, should it be permitted at all, will be brief. When you step inside, the world is different. The curtains are drawn against the grey afternoon. The room smells faintly of lavender, of coal smoke from the small grate. There is the particular warm stillness of a space that has been shut away from the rest of the house for several hours. The light is soft and amber, golden where the candle flame touches the wallpaper. The sounds from downstairs, the clatter, the voices, the street outside, come through as if from a great distance, present but muffled, very far away. The room has been arranged for its purpose. There is a sofa, because Victorian invalid culture was specific enough to have its own furniture category. Beside it sits a small table with exactly the right things on it. A glass of water, a small bottle of something the doctor prescribed, a few carefully chosen flowers in a vase. A book, perhaps, if reading has been permitted. The whole arrangement has the quality of deliberate managed care. This is a room set up for someone whose comfort matters, someone who is, for now, the priority. And on the sofa, propped against a bank of cushions, there is a woman. She is not rushing. She's not managing the household accounts or consulting the diary or composing careful replies to social letters. She might be reading a novel or a book of poems, the kind she was often quietly discouraged from spending too long with. She might be writing in a private journal slowly in words entirely her own. She might simply be sitting in the stillness, listening to the fire settle in the grate, watching the candle flame move, thinking her own thoughts, uninterrupted for the first time all day. The door is closed. The servants know not to knock unless it's urgent. Her husband knows not to press. And the world beyond the curtains, the morning calls, the luncheons, the endless careful performance, is required for this afternoon to wait. The sofa you're looking at has its own history. You may know it by another name, the fainting couch, or the chaise longue, or simply the invalid sofa. It appeared in Victorian homes in several varieties, but they shared one defining feature. They were designed for a body that was neither fully horizontal nor fully upright, a body that was resting without sleeping, recovering without being bedridden, present in the room but exempted from its demands. The Victorians had thought carefully about this specific condition, and they had built dedicated furniture for it, which is its own form of social acknowledgement. When a condition becomes common enough to require its own furniture category, that tells you something. It has become a permanent feature of the landscape. The small table beside the sofa is worth your attention too. It tells you what was considered necessary for this particular kind of rest. There is a glass of water. Hydration was one of the few things the Victorians reliably agreed on. There is a small bottle, probably a tincture prescribed by the household physician on his last visit. There may be a second bottle beside it, something labelled as a restorative tonic, or a patent remedy, or a nerve-strengthening formula. These were sold in considerable quantities in Victorian England, and they were marketed almost exclusively to women. They contained in most cases alcohol. Some contained opiates, some contained both. But that is a story for a little later tonight. For now, the thing on the table that draws your attention is the book, because here is something the Victorian sickroom gave women that almost no other social space in their lives provided. Permission to read, not household account books, not letters requiring reply, not the improving religious literature considered appropriate for women's leisure, fiction, novels, the kind of books that Victorian medical and moral authorities viewed with deep suspicion. They were considered too stimulating for already delicate nerves, too likely to excite the imagination, too apt to give a woman thought she might not otherwise have had. And yet here was the paradox. A woman who was unwell couldn't be expected to manage the household. She couldn't oversee the servants or organize the social calendar or prepare for visitors. but she could, lying on her sofa or propped among her pillows, be quietly permitted to read a novel. Because what else was she going to do? The alternative was staring at the ceiling, and even the most nervous of Victorian physicians was prepared to accept that this was not an improvement. The result was that Victorian sick rooms became, quietly and surprisingly, excellent reading environments. Women who were officially ill read voraciously. They read novels that charted the emotional lives of people like themselves, novels about people navigating the same social worlds, the same marriages, the same quiet suffocations. They read poetry. They corresponded extensively with friends who were similarly confined, in other houses, other rooms, other cities. The correspondence networks among Victorian invalid women were sometimes extraordinarily rich. Historians have noted that some of the most alive intellectual exchanges of the era ran between women on sofas, but novels were only part of it. Many of these women also wrote, and this is where the sick room becomes something more interesting than a refuge. Because the Victorian sick room gave women something their ordinary lives almost entirely denied them: time, unstructured, undemanded, unhurried time, in which to think their own thoughts and put some of those thoughts into words. The journals that survive from Victorian invalid women are striking documents, not because they record suffering, though some do, but because of how often they record something that sounds, unmistakably, like intellectual freedom. Women who spent their healthy hours managing household details found, in the sick room, hours in which to think, about history, about poetry, about things they'd read that morning, about the letters they wanted to write to people they actually found interesting. The contrast between journal entries written in health and those written during illness is sometimes startling. The entries written during illness are frequently the more alive ones. This is one of the more poignant ironies of the whole arrangement. The sick room was designed as a space of passivity, rest, quiet, the absence of demands. But what women actually did in those spaces when given the chance was often the opposite. They read, they wrote, they thought, they corresponded, and in doing so they created a private intellectual life that their public social lives had no room for. The doctor visited, of course. He was an important figure in the life of a sick room, important in ways that went beyond the purely medical. He arrived with the weight of professional authority. He took the patient's pulse, observed her pallor, asked careful questions about her symptoms, and wrote things in a notebook. He prescribed tonics, and rest, and quiet. In some cases he prescribed the specific avoidance of any activity that might tax the nerves. He left a sense of seriousness behind him, a confirmation that what was happening in this room was real, medically recognized, not to be trifled with. For many women, that confirmation was itself part of the value. The doctor's visit made it official. It was no longer a headache or a bad mood or a reluctance to face the day. It was a condition, something with a name, something that required professional management, which is why many Victorian women cultivated their relationship with their household physicians with considerable care, and why those physicians sometimes found that their invalid patients were unusually pleased to see them. The food deserves a mention too. Victorian invalid cookery was a specialized field. There were entire cookbooks devoted to it, recipes designed specifically for people too unwell to manage a regular meal. The menu of a well-run Victorian sick room might include beef tea, a slow-cooked broth believed to restore the constitution, or arrowroot pudding, which was bland and easily digestible and considered excellent for the nerves, or a soft-boiled egg, or, On days when the patient was improving, a small glass of something strengthening. The invalid was expected to eat carefully from food specially prepared and brought to her, which meant that for the length of her illness she was also exempt from managing meals, that daily task which in ordinary health fell entirely to her. The light in the room was carefully managed too. Strong light was considered injurious to delicate nerves, which was one reason the curtains stayed drawn during daylight hours. Candlelight was softer, more forgiving, less agitating to the eyes and the mind. It created an atmosphere that is very specific, and when you describe it sounds almost deliberate. Warm, dim, enclosed, cut off from the world outside. A room in which time moved differently, not according to the demands of the social calendar, but at its own pace, governed by the fire and the candle and the stillness of a woman with nowhere she was required to be. You can feel it if you let yourself. You're in the room right now, in a sense, in the amber half-light, in the warmth of the small fire, in the quiet, the lavender, the coal smoke, the soft weight of the blanket across your legs. Something in this combination that the body recognizes even across 150 years. It is the feeling of being let off, of the world receding just far enough to allow you to breathe at your own pace. This kind of rest, not the forced medicalized rest that the doctors tried to impose, but this soft withdrawal, this private afternoon, this room that asks nothing of you. This is what the sick room, at its best, actually offered. Not illness, permission. There is a dimension of the story we should not gloss over, even in the warmth of this amber room. The sick room as a refuge only worked under specific conditions, with a specific kind of household, a specific kind of husband, a specific kind of illness that stayed within socially acceptable boundaries. A woman who was too ill created worry and disruption. A woman who was not ill enough invited skepticism. The calibration required was exact. Too healthy, and the refuge collapsed. Too sick, and it became something else entirely, a genuine confinement, managed by the household for the household's benefit rather than hers. The line between asylum and prison has never, in any era, been as clear as the people building the institution would like. Some women entered the sick room for a week and found, a year later, that they couldn't leave. Not because they didn't want to, but because the identity of invalid had become the only identity they had. The world outside had moved on. The social machinery had reconfigured itself in their absence. Getting out was, in some cases, considerably harder than getting in. But we'll return to that side of the story. For now, we are still in the room, in the warm amber light, in the particular stillness of an October afternoon that has been, for once, given back to the woman who lives here. The candle on the bedside table, you keep coming back to it. A small thing, a tallow candle or beeswax if the household is prosperous enough. The flame is small and very steady in the still air of the room. It has been burning for hours, it will burn for hours more. And there is something in that constancy. The flame simply continues, without urgency, without needing anything from anyone. It echoes the quality of the afternoon itself. This is what the Victorian sickroom felt like at its most functional. Not a space of suffering, or not only that, a space of permission, a space in which the demands of the world outside had been, for a measurable stretch of time, officially suspended. The fire burned. The candle burned. The afternoon settled around you like something warm and patient. And the woman in the bed was not required to be anything other than what she was, which was, and this is worth remembering, a person, with thoughts of her own, with preferences of her own. and a relationship with her own mind that Victorian life gave her almost no time to explore. The sickroom, imperfect as it was, gave her some of that time back. Not much, not safely, not without cost, but some. And that was enough to change things. We'll come to how in just a moment. But first, there is something you need to know about the name the doctors had for what was wrong with these women. Because the diagnosis, the one that sent thousands to their beds, to their sofas, to years of prescribed rest, was one of the most extraordinary pieces of medical thinking in the whole of the 19th century. Not because it was accurate, because it was spectacularly, comprehensively, almost impressively wrong. And it had been wrong in various forms for over 2,000 years. The name was hysteria. It came from the ancient Greek word for uterus, hystera, which tells you something important about how the ancient world understood what was wrong with women. The theory, held with great confidence and almost no evidence, was that the uterus was a mobile organ, that it could, under certain conditions, move around inside a woman's body, wander, as it were, and when it wandered into the wrong area, it caused whatever symptom was most inconvenient at the time. The treatment, naturally, was to return the uterus to its proper place. Various methods were proposed across the centuries: fumigation, strong smells. What ancient physicians described as persuading the uterus back through pleasant aromas applied to the appropriate regions. It was, to put it gently, an imprecise science. What is remarkable is not that the ancient Greeks believed this. The ancient Greeks believed many things that turned out to be wrong. They were working at least from first principles in a world without microscopes. What is remarkable is that this theory survived in various forms all the way through the 19th century. The Victorians didn't believe in the wandering uterus quite as literally as Plato did, but the underlying logic that women's mental and emotional difficulties were rooted in their reproductive system remained almost entirely intact. The same framework, dressed in different language. And if you follow that logic forward, what you find is not a narrowing diagnosis. What you find is an expanding one. By the Victorian era, hysteria had been thoroughly modernized. The wandering uterus had been replaced by nervous exhaustion. The language had become more scientific, the framework more medical. But the fundamental premise was the same. Women's bodies were inherently unstable, their nervous systems were inherently fragile, and their propensity for breakdown was inherent to their sex, not to the conditions of their lives. Think of the physician's consulting room for a moment. Dark wood, a gas lamp burning over the desk, the patient sitting across from him, listing her symptoms, precisely, carefully. The physician nodding, writing it down. Whatever she presented, the box was usually already there. What made Victorian hysteria extraordinary was the sheer breadth of what it could diagnose. The symptom list was not a fixed thing. It was by the middle of the 19th century almost entirely elastic. Hysteria could explain headaches, and fatigue, and crying, and laughing at the wrong moment. It could explain a persistent cough or a persistent silence. It could explain a woman who didn't eat enough and a woman who ate too much. It could explain a woman who was too emotional and a woman who was suspiciously unemotional. The list, written in careful copperplate in Victorian medical textbooks, takes up several pages. It could also explain things that were not symptoms of illness at all. Having too many opinions, reading too many books, wanting to travel, expressing a desire for education or professional work, declining to perform domestic duties with sufficient cheerfulness. These were classified in Victorian medical literature as potential manifestations of hysteria. Not metaphorically and not by eccentric physicians on the fringe. by mainstream Victorian medicine, by the kind of doctors who wrote the textbooks. By the mid-Victorian period, hysteria had become so culturally embedded that it had its own aesthetic. You would recognize the hysterical woman of Victorian fiction immediately, prone to fainting, to sudden weeping, to inexplicable trembling and physical collapse. She was a figure of both sympathy and spectacle. Sympathy because she was presumably ill, spectacle because hysteria was dramatic in ways that most genuine illness is not. And the drama, it turned out, was part of the problem. A woman who fainted dramatically in a drawing room was performing, whether she intended to or not. And performance, as any Victorian doctor would tell you, was a symptom. A diagnosis with no fixed symptoms, no reliable treatment, and no clear criteria. One applicable to any woman at any time for any reason. That is not a medical category. It is a social control mechanism written in medical language, and it's genuinely hard when you look at the list of hysterical symptoms not to notice something. It maps almost perfectly onto the list of things Victorian society found most inconvenient about women. The Victorians, to give them their due, were aware that this diagnosis was broad. There were physicians who argued that hysteria was being overused, that the diagnosis was becoming a catch-all for whatever a doctor couldn't otherwise explain. These physicians were correct. They are also largely ignored. The mainstream response was to expand the diagnosis further and to develop treatments, because once you had a diagnosis, you needed something to do about it. And this is where the Victorian medical establishment applied itself with truly impressive energy and creativity. One of the most straightforward treatments was marriage. The logic was perfectly consistent if you accepted the underlying premise. If her problems originated in her reproductive system, and that system was designed for childbearing, then directing it toward its designed purpose should logically restore equilibrium. Doctors genuinely wrote this in their notes. Get married. Have children. The cure for hysteria was domesticity, which was, in a sense, the cure for everything as far as the Victorian medical establishment was concerned. Think about what it would mean to live inside a diagnostic category like this. You might come to a physician with legitimate pain, legitimate exhaustion, legitimate unhappiness with your circumstances. He would look at you, write a word in his notebook, and send you home with a tonic. The word in the notebook meant that whatever you were experiencing was a function of your sex, not of your circumstances. It meant there was nothing to change about the situation, only something to manage about the patient. And then there was Isaac Baker Brown. Baker Brown was a prominent gynecological surgeon in mid-Victorian England, a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, a published author, a man his colleagues recognised as exceptionally confident. In the early 1860s he developed a theory. Hysteria, epilepsy, and other nervous conditions in women were caused, he argued, by a specific kind of irritation. He believed he had located the source of this irritation, and he believed he had found a surgical solution. In 1866, Baker Brown published a book. Its title was On the Curability of Certain Forms of Insanity, Epilepsy, Catalepsy, and Hysteria in Females. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary document. It described in clinical detail the procedure he had been performing on his patients with nervous complaints. He was surgically removing the clitoris, on the grounds that this was the site of the irritation he had identified. He performed this procedure without informing his patients of what he intended. He performed it without their consent. He performed it on women who came to him for entirely different complaints. In April of 1867, the Obstetrical Society of London held a meeting to investigate his conduct. The proceedings were, by all accounts, hostile. He was given limited opportunity to defend himself. He was expelled from the society. What is worth noting, and historians have noted it carefully, is precisely why he was expelled. Not because the obstetrical society considered the procedure itself monstrous. Not because they believed female surgical patients had a right to informed consent. The society expelled Baker Brown because he had performed it without the knowledge of his patients' husbands. The wrong party had been kept in the dark. Baker Brown died in poverty in 1873. The underlying view that female nervous illness could be located in and remedied through the female body survived him with considerable comfort. His successors were more careful. They performed their interventions with rather more attention to the sensibilities of the husbands involved. But the underlying approach, treating female nervous illness through physical management of the female body, continued well into the 20th century. We are not finished with that history tonight. The hysteria diagnosis continued to evolve through the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th. It narrowed somewhat, as other categories were developed to absorb parts of its enormous range. Neurasthenia took some of it. Depression took more. Conversion disorder took a portion. Various anxiety-related diagnoses absorbed others. But the word hysteria persisted in formal psychiatric use until 1980. That is when the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove it from its official diagnostic manual. In 1980, after more than 2,000 years as a formal medical category, sit with that for a moment, 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks decided that a wandering uterus explained female distress. That idea, in various forms, names and treatments, remained functioning medical infrastructure until the year the first space shuttle flew. The medical establishment had opinions. They were held with tremendous confidence. Across an extraordinary span of time, they were wrong. Now, before we follow what the doctors actually did about all of this, there is one more thing you should know about what happened to the women who received this diagnosis, because the diagnosis was only the beginning. What came next was the treatment, and the treatment was designed by the most eminent neurologist in America. Its goal was to restore a hysterical woman to the proper performance of domestic life. It involved 6 to 8 weeks of bed rest, complete isolation from family and friends, a high-calorie diet, daily massage, and a total ban on all intellectual activity, including reading, writing, and creative work of any kind. It was called the Rest Cure, and the story of what it actually did, and what one woman in particular did in response, is one of the most important stories in this whole history. But before we get there are a few more things about the hysteria diagnosis itself that are worth sitting with. Because the diagnosis didn't just send women to bed. It shaped what they were allowed to think about themselves, and what the people around them were allowed to think too. What it actually felt like to receive a hysteria diagnosis. The patient record gives us occasional glimpses. Letters, diaries, and private accounts suggest that women's responses varied considerably. Some received the diagnosis with relief. It gave a name to something they'd been experiencing without language for. Some received it with resignation, confirming what they'd already suspected the doctor was going to say. Some received it with quiet fury, which they then had nowhere to direct, since fury itself was of course a symptom. And some received it as plain information, filed it away, and continued navigating their lives with whatever tools were available, which, as it turned out, sometimes included the sickroom, and sometimes included something else entirely. I had no idea about this until I started researching for this video. Did you know that Victorian physicians at various points estimated hysteria to affect more than half of all women? Not half of women who came to doctors, half of all women. That number tells you less about female health and more about the diagnostic framework doing the measuring. By contrast, consider what happened when a man developed the same symptoms: exhaustion, nervous collapse, inability to function, depression, sleeplessness, a general inability to engage with the demands of life. The medical establishment had a diagnosis for this too. It was called Neurasthenia, coined by the American neurologist George Beard in 1869. It was considered a disease of civilization, a malady that struck the high-achieving, the intellectually active, the professionally overstretched. It carried no stigma. It implied, in fact, a distinction. To be neurasthenic was to have pushed yourself too hard in pursuit of worthy goals. The treatment for male neurasthenia was not bed rest, isolation, and a ban on reading. It was the West cure, sending men to the American West for camping, cattle roping, and vigorous outdoor activity. Theodore Roosevelt underwent something like it. Walt Whitman reportedly benefited from it. Owen Wister used it as material for the Virginian. The same exhaustion, the same collapse. Two entirely opposite prescriptions. One designed to restore a woman to domestic passivity. One designed to restore a man to vigorous public life. There is something worth pausing on in all of this. Not in outrage, exactly, but in recognition. The hysteria diagnosis was genuinely useful. Just not to the woman. To the husband it explained a troublesome wife without requiring any change in the household arrangement. To the doctor it provided a diagnosis for unexplained symptoms and a patient who would need ongoing treatment. To Victorian society more broadly, it explained female discontent as a medical condition. And medical conditions, unlike political ones, had nothing to do with changing the law. A woman who was unhappy because of the law was a political problem. A woman who was unhappy because of her uterus was a medical one. The distinction mattered enormously, and yet many of the doctors who applied this diagnosis were not cynical men. They were often genuinely trying to help. They worked within an inherited intellectual framework, and that framework was wrong in ways they couldn't see. The women who came to them were genuinely suffering. That part was real. The diagnosis was wrong. The treatment was often wrong. But the suffering it was trying to address, the exhaustion, the despair, the unrealized potential, that was real. And it persisted, whether you called it hysteria or something else or nothing at all. Which brings us to what was actually in that small bottle on the bedside table. Because the Victorian woman who'd been declared hysterical or nervously exhausted did not, for the most part, simply go home and rest. She went home with medicine, and the medicine that was most commonly given, the medicine that sat on bedside tables across England, ordered without hesitation and taken without question, was a substance called laudanum. Laudanum had been around since the 17th century. It was, in its simplest form, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, typically at a concentration of around 10%, which means that a tablespoon of laudanum contained roughly the equivalent of 3 grains of opium, a meaningful dose. The kind of thing you probably want to know before you start taking it daily for your nerves. The Victorian era treated laudanum with approximately the same routine acceptance the modern world extends to ibuprofen. It was available at any chemist, any market stall, from any travelling hawker, without a prescription, for most of the century. A few pennies across the counter. No questions asked. You could order it in the same transaction as soap and candles, take it home in a small brown bottle, and set it on the bedside table with the same everyday presence as a glass of water. Laudanum appears throughout Victorian literature as exactly this kind of background detail. A small bottle on a table, a character reaching for relief, an unremarkable presence in the household. It appears in Dickens, in Wilkie Collins, in Elizabeth Gaskell. Dracula contains it. The Woman in White builds an entire subplot around it. The reason it appears so naturally in these narratives is that it was entirely natural in the lives of the people those narratives depicted. It was domestic. It was, in the vocabulary of the Victorian household, simply something you kept. The patent medicines aimed at women were sold under domestically reassuring names. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for teething infants, which contained morphine sulfate and alcohol in quantities a modern pharmacist would find alarming. The soothing effect was real. The infant mortality associated with it was also real. For adult women, for the women managing nervous complaints, laudanum was the Swiss Army knife of the Victorian medicine cabinet. Headache, laudanum, menstrual cramps, laudanum, grief, laudanum, anxiety, laudanum, a general nervous exhaustion of any description, laudanum, and perhaps also a tonic wine, which was laudanum's slightly more socially respectable cousin, and contained much the same things in a form more easily offered to visitors. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 introduced the first formal regulation of opium-based substances in Britain. It required that such products be sold only by registered chemists and pharmacists. It did not limit the quantities sold. It did not meaningfully restrict the most popular patent medicines, which continued to list their opium content politely on their labels and sell in increasing volumes. In practice, the 1868 Act changed less than it appeared. The chemist was now your supplier instead of the market stall. The transaction was otherwise identical. You still walked out with the small brown bottle. You still set it on the bedside table beside the carefully chosen flowers and the book you'd been permitted to read. And then there are the numbers, because the numbers are genuinely striking. Late 19th century surveys from the United States, where similar patterns of prescription and use prevailed, found that women constituted approximately 61% of opium addicts in Michigan in 1878, 72% in Chicago in 1880, 63% in Iowa in 1885. These were not women who had sought out opium recreationally. They were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, women introduced to opiate-based medicines through entirely legitimate medical prescriptions. For menstrual pain, for nervous conditions, for grief, for the management of whatever had been classified as a female complaint. The prescriptions had been written in good faith. The medicines had been taken as directed, and in significant numbers dependency had followed. There was also a treatment that Victorian medical literature refers to with characteristic delicacy as pelvic massage. This was the manual manipulation of the pelvic region by a physician, intended to relieve the congestion thought to cause nervous symptoms in women. It was practiced widely, taken entirely seriously as a medical intervention, and written about in clinical literature as both effective and professionally appropriate. The physician who performed it was, in his own understanding, conducting a legitimate medical treatment. Historians who have examined the practice have had somewhat different views. The picture that emerges, when you look at the Victorian treatment economy for nervous women, is one of almost perfect circularity. The diagnosis was hysteria. The treatment was medicine, typically opiate-based, typically prescribed by a physician. The medicine provided real short-term relief from real symptoms. It also, in many cases, created a physiological dependence that required further medicine. The further medicine was prescribed. The dependence deepened. The symptoms continued. and the woman, who had originally come in with exhaustion or grief or pain produced by the specific conditions of her life, found herself, years later, in the grip of a dependency that the original conditions had nothing to do with. The Victorian term for this was forming a habit. The women who had formed such habits were viewed, depending on the perspective, as unfortunate, or as weak, or as in need of stronger medical management. The possibility that the medical management itself had created the problem was not, for the most part of the clinical conversation. What was part of the clinical conversation, in considerable detail, was the management of symptoms. And the Victorian medical establishment had a growing inventory of substances with which to manage them. Laudanum was the most familiar, but it was not alone. By the 1860s, 2 additional substances had entered the Victorian medicine cabinet with considerable momentum. The first was chloral hydrate, synthesized in 1832, formally established as a sedative in 1869. Chloral hydrate dissolved in alcohol and was typically administered as a draught, a small, bitter liquid. It was fast-acting. It produced a heavy, deep sleep within 30 minutes. Victorian physicians found it enormously useful. It was prescribed freely, for insomnia, for nervous excitability, for chronic agitation that couldn't otherwise be quieted, and it was prescribed to women in significantly larger quantities than to men, because women, in the Victorian medical framework, were more prone to the kind of nervous agitation that required quieting. The second substance was potassium bromide, typically just called bromide. It arrived in medical practice in the 1850s as an anticonvulsant, primarily for epilepsy. By the 1860s, its use had been extended considerably. Bromide had a sedative effect. It dampened nervous excitability, and it was considerably cheaper than laudanum. It was also used, with confident Victorian directness, for what the medical literature called excessive venereal excitement in women, which is one of the more striking diagnostic categories in the history of medicine. A woman who expressed sexual interest or who failed to suppress such interest could be treated with bromide. A woman who was, in the clinical language, overexcitable in ways her physician found inappropriate could be treated with bromide. The bromide was administered as a white powder dissolved in water. It tasted slightly salty. You took it every day. It made you, broadly speaking, less yourself, less interested, less engaged, less responsive, which was, in the Victorian clinical framework, progress. It is worth pausing on that phrase, because less yourself is in fact what chronic bromide use produced. The sensation described in personal journals and medical accounts of women who had been using bromide for an extended period is notably consistent across accounts. A kind of blankness, a flattening. The sharp edges of experience, the anxiety, yes, but also the curiosity, the irritability, the engagement, the desire, became muted. The world continued, and you were present in it, but at a remove. Some women found this a relief. Some found it deeply disturbing. Some found it both, simultaneously, and had no language for the contradiction. There is something remarkably consistent across all of these treatments. Whether laudanum or chloral hydrate or bromide or the various tonic wines, they all moved in the same direction. They quieted, they sedated, they dimmed. They reduced a woman's engagement with the world around her, her energy, her agitation, her willingness to resist or refuse. They made her, in the language of the era, calmer. They made her, in the language of what was actually happening, smaller. The treatment for female nervous illness was, overwhelmingly, a treatment that removed the capacity for response. And then there were the surgical treatments. because some physicians were not satisfied with chemistry alone. Batty's operation, formerly known as normal ovariotomy, was developed by the American surgeon Robert Batty in 1872. It involved surgically removing the ovaries from women who were not suffering from ovarian disease, but from nervous conditions, epilepsy, hysteria, chronic pain, insanity. The logic was by now familiar. If female disturbance was rooted in the reproductive system, removing it should remove the disturbance. Batty performed the first operation in 1872. By the 1880s, the procedure had spread across the United States and Britain. Some estimates suggest approximately 150,000 women underwent it by the end of the century. The women who had undergone Batty's operation experienced what we would now recognize as symptoms of premature menopause: hot flashes, loss of bone density, chronic fatigue, depression, emotional volatility. These were, in many cases, significantly worse than the nervous complaints that had led to the surgery. Some of these women returned to their physicians with new complaints that were added to their existing medical file. Some were diagnosed with hysteria again. The irony of this outcome seems, for the most part, to have been lost on the physicians involved. The operation was eventually abandoned, not because the underlying theory was reconsidered, but because the complication rate was too high. The theory had been tested on an extraordinary number of women before it was found wanting. The treatments available to you depended, in all of this, very much on who you were. The wealthy woman had access to specialists, quality laudanum, and eventually the rest cure at a reputable facility. The middle-class woman relied on her household physician, the chemist's patent medicines, and domestic management. The working-class woman largely couldn't afford to be ill at all. But if she became ill enough to need treatment, she was far more likely to end up in a charitable institution, far less likely to receive the careful individual attention the wealthier patient took for granted. Both systems removed the problem of the difficult woman from the social landscape, by different means, at different cost. And there, through all of this, is the small brown bottle, still on the bedside table, beside the carefully chosen flowers, next to the glass of water, beside the book that has perhaps been permitted, the sick room we visited at the beginning of this evening, the candle burning, the curtains drawn, the world required to wait, was not entirely the refuge it appeared. Some of the women resting in those rooms were resting under the management of a pharmaceutical economy that had as much interest in their continued dependence as in their recovery. The amber stillness had sometimes a chemical component. What is harder to find in the historical record is the experience of women who refused, who declined the laudanum, or took it once and put it down, or saw clearly enough what was happening to choose a different path. They are less visible because their refusal was, by definition, the less documented route. The women who accepted treatment generated medical notes, prescription records, household accounts. The women who quietly said no generated considerably less paperwork. But they existed, and some of them found a different way through, which is where the sick room comes back into the story, and where the story becomes something considerably more interesting. The rest cure was designed by a man named Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell was, by the 1870s, the most eminent neurologist in America. He had done significant work during the Civil War on nerve injuries and phantom limb phenomena. He was a published author. He was in almost every recognizable sense a figure of established authority, and he was deeply, comprehensively certain about what was wrong with hysterical women and what needed to be done about it. He was by all accounts a man who did not particularly invite disagreement. He was celebrated, confident, and accustomed to deference. His clinical approach to hysterical women reflected this. He positioned himself explicitly as an authority in whom the patient was required to place complete trust. His treatment required that she relinquish control of her time, her food, her movement, her reading, her correspondence. All of it passed during the rest cure into his management, which looked at clearly the removal of every form of autonomy a woman possessed, administered by a physician in the name of recovery. What she recovered, at the end of it, was the capacity to return to the life she'd come from. His theory was that the nervous system, like a muscle, could be depleted by overuse. Recovery required absolute rest, not partial rest, not the kind of rest available in a room where you could read and correspond and quietly think. Total rest, horizontal, isolated, entirely free of intellectual stimulus, the kind of rest that prevented any possibility of the nervous system doing anything at all. The specifics of the rest cure, if you read them now, are quite striking. The patient was confined to bed, not occasionally, continuously. She was not permitted to sit up. She was not permitted to read or write or sew or engage in any creative activity. She was fed a high-calorie diet, in some cases by the physician himself. She was given daily massage, administered by an attendant, and she was isolated, completely, deliberately, from family, friends, and all correspondence, for 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes longer. Mitchell believed this would work by giving the nervous system a complete opportunity to restore itself, without demands, without stimulation, without the mental exertion he believed had caused the breakdown in the first place. Women came to him exhausted, depleted, unable to function. They left after several weeks of his regime, having gained weight, looking better, and capable of returning to their domestic responsibilities. This was his evidence. This was his proof. What Mitchell did not track, what the rest cure's clinical record does not document, was what happened next. Whether those women, returned to the conditions that had produced their breakdown, remained well. Whether the improvement lasted, whether the nervous exhaustion returned, as the demands of their lives returned, unchanged. The short-term outcome looked like success. The longer view is considerably more ambiguous. One woman, however, tracked it very carefully indeed. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And what she wrote about her experience of the rest cure in a short story published in 1892 in a magazine under her name changed the conversation in ways that Silas Weir Mitchell never anticipated and never quite forgave. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in 1860 in Hartford, Connecticut. She was not the kind of woman the Victorian medical establishment had in mind for the rest cure. She was a writer, a lecturer, a feminist thinker whose later work would help shape the era. She married the artist Charles Walter Stetson in 1884. She had a daughter in 1885, and in 1887, at 26, she experienced a complete nervous breakdown. The breakdown had, Gilman understood in retrospect, specific roots. She had been a relatively independent woman before her marriage, writing, developing her ideas, living on her own terms. Marriage had changed the shape of her life in ways she had not anticipated. The domestic obligations had expanded. The writing time had contracted. The intellectual work that had been the centre of her days had been, steadily, by the demands of household and infant, crowded out. When the breakdown came, it was not random. It was the culmination of specific pressures on a specific kind of mind. The breakdown itself was genuine. This is not in question. Gilman described it in her autobiography, the increasing inability to function, the weeping that had no obvious cause, the paralytic exhaustion. She was referred to Silas Weir Mitchell. She went to his clinic in Philadelphia. She underwent the rest cure. What followed, by her own account, was a reasonably smooth clinical experience. Mitchell was attentive. The regime was as described. She gained weight. She rested. She was isolated from her correspondence and her work. And after several weeks, Mitchell declared her improved and sent her home, with instructions. The instructions were these: she was to live as domestic a life as possible. She was to have her child with her at all times. She was to have at most 2 hours of intellectual activity per day, and she was never, under any circumstances, to touch pen, brush, or pencil again. Gilman followed these instructions for 3 months, and came, as she described it later, to the borderline of utter mental ruin. She describes this period in terms specific enough to be clinical: the inability to hold a thought, the feeling of intelligence fraying at the edges, the loss of the very qualities that had constituted her sense of self. She was, by the terms of Mitchell's prescription, doing everything right. She was managing the household. She was not writing. She was not thinking too hard. She was, in the language of the rescuer, resting. And she was, in the language of her own experience, dissolving. At some point in those 3 months, she doesn't give an exact date, she made a decision. She would ignore Mitchell's instructions. She would return to her work, and she would see what happened. She got better, not immediately, not completely, but significantly, and in direct correlation with the return to work. The intellectual work Mitchell had prescribed as harmful turned out to be the thing that made her functional. The rest he had prescribed as curative was, in her specific case, the thing that had been dismantling her. She recovered not by following the medical advice she'd been given, but by violating it with considerable deliberateness. In 1890, 3 years after her treatment, she began writing the story. She wrote it in 2 days, reportedly. It was about 11 pages. It was narrated by a woman brought to a country house for rest. She is, we are told, nervous and slightly hysterical. She requires quiet, fresh air and the absence of stimulation. Her husband is a physician. He is prescribed rest. He is forbidden writing. And the narrator, writing in secret, in stolen moments, becomes fixated on the yellow wallpaper of the room she's been confined to. The wallpaper is hideous. She can see a pattern in it, one that shifts with the light, that seems to move when she watches. Behind the pattern, she becomes convinced there is a woman trapped behind the paper, shaking the bars of the pattern, trying to get out. As the isolation deepens, she begins to see the woman more clearly. She begins to help her. She begins, herself, to creep. The wallpaper stands in the story for something very specific. The diagnostic and institutional framework being applied to the narrator's mind. The bars of the pattern are the bars of the prescription. The woman trapped behind the paper is the narrator's own intelligence, trapped behind the medical injunction against using it. The story works as a narrative of breakdown. Read another way, it is also a very precise account of what happens when you take a functioning mind and systematically deprive it of everything that makes it function. The result is not rest. The result is exactly what the story shows. The yellow wallpaper ends with the narrator having lost her mind in the room she was given to recuperate in. Her husband, the physician, comes to find her and faints. She has torn the wallpaper from the walls. She's creeping around the room. She is, by every clinical measure, worse than when she arrived. Gilman sent a copy to Silas Weir Mitchell. We don't know whether he read it. We do know that some years later he reportedly said the story had persuaded him to change his approach. Whether this is true or something closer to damage control is an open question. What we know for certain is that the yellow wallpaper was read, widely and immediately, and what it described struck women across the English-speaking world as something they recognised. The texture of confinement, of being forbidden to write, of watching the days lengthen in a room that was supposed to heal you and was instead doing something else. Gilman was not the only woman who went through a version of this experience. The pattern was common enough that historians have traced it across multiple cases. Women who came to Mitchell or his trained physicians were prescribed the rest cure, experienced varying degrees of deterioration during treatment, and either eventually recovered by returning to the work they had been forbidden or did not recover at all. Alice James is perhaps the most striking parallel case. She was the sister of William James, the philosopher, and Henry James, the novelist. She was a woman of exceptional intelligence and wit who spent most of her adult life as an invalid. She'd been ill in various ways since adolescence. She saw doctors. She was prescribed treatments. She was told to rest. She did rest. She remained ill. In 1889, at 39 and terminally diagnosed with breast cancer, she began keeping a diary. The diary she kept for the last 3 years of her life is one of the most remarkable Victorian documents. Alive, sharp, full of irony and observation, and genuine intellectual engagement. Written by a woman told for decades that intellectual engagement was the source of her problem. The diary was not published until 1934, long after her death. Her brother Henry had asked her not to publish it in her lifetime. That request gives you a sense of what the diary must have contained even before you open it. There is a pattern in all of this worth naming plainly. The women who came through the Victorian treatment economy, who survived the rest cure, or refused it, or simply endured it and recovered on their own terms, often did so by continuing to do the thing they had been forbidden to do. They wrote, they thought, they kept diaries, they corresponded. They found ways, within the constraints of their invalidism, to stay connected to their own minds, and some of them produced in the process work that outlasted everything the medical establishment had prescribed for them. The rest cure produced something its creator had not intended. By removing women from their intellectual lives, from their journals and their pens and their creative work, it created in some of them an experience of deprivation so acute that it generated its own documentation. The yellow wallpaper, Alice James's diary, the letters of dozens of women who wrote, in the margins of their prescribed rest, about what that rest was actually like. Mitchell designed a treatment intended to silence women. What he got, in certain cases, was the opposite, which is, if you think about it, one of the more satisfying reversals in the history of medicine. But first, the women who took the Victorian sickroom not as a temporary refuge, but as a permanent one. The women who built entire lives, entire intellectual legacies from inside a bedroom. Because some of the most remarkable Victorian women were, by the standards of their time, barely functional, and by the standards of what they actually produced, extraordinary. Florence Nightingale took to her bed in 1857 at the age of 37. She remained there, more or less, for the next 53 years. She died in 1910 at the age of 90. In those 53 years she produced approximately 200 major works, reports, books, pamphlets, detailed statistical analyses. These reshaped army sanitation, hospital design, public health infrastructure, and nursing education across the British Empire. She managed campaigns, she received government ministers, she corresponded with heads of state, she was the single most influential force in the reform of British military medicine and the creation of professional nursing, all from a declared position of chronic invalidism. What was wrong with Florence Nightingale? The question has been debated extensively. The most credible current theory is brucellosis, a bacterial infection she likely contracted during the Crimean War. It produces chronic fatigue, muscle pain, and recurring fevers. There's also the possibility of what we would now call PTSD, given what she witnessed at Scutari. And there is also, and historians have been careful and specific about this, the strategic dimension. Her bedroom was not simply a sick room, it was a headquarters. In 1859, she published Notes on Nursing, a book that established the foundations of modern nursing practice and had to be reprinted almost immediately. In 1863, she produced an extensive statistical analysis of mortality in India, based on data she had solicited from colonial authorities, which contributed directly to major public health reforms. In the 1870s, she was consulted on the design of the new St. Thomas's Hospital in London. She had her own ideas about ward layout, grounded in her statistical analysis of patient mortality under different conditions. She was also, during all of this, corresponding with approximately 2,000 people per year. Most of this work was done in the evenings, by candlelight, in the room that the world had been told she was too ill to leave. From her bedroom in South Street, Mayfair, Nightingale managed information, controlled access, and directed political campaigns. She decided who could come to her. No casual caller got through. The ministers and generals who wanted to see her had to make appointments. They had to come prepared, with the right information and the right disposition. And when they came, they found a woman of extraordinary intellectual authority. In bed, yes, but entirely in command. She was also highly effective at using her illness as a tool in the political process itself. A healthy Nightingale could be argued with, dismissed, pressured into committee she disagreed with. An invalid Nightingale could not. She could not be required to appear in public. She could not be enrolled in processes she found counterproductive. Her bed insulated her from the social and political machinery that would otherwise have required her to compromise, which meant she could be, in her intellectual work, rather more uncompromising than most. She was also aware of the performative dimension of her situation, acutely and intelligently aware. There is a letter in which she describes her illness as convenient, in a tone of complete deniability. The historians who have written about her most carefully have concluded that her invalidism was probably both genuine and strategic. She was genuinely ill. She was also genuinely strategic. Both things were true. Both things served the same woman. Elizabeth Barrett Browning presents a different but equally striking version of the same story. You may remember her from the beginning of this evening, the room she compared to a prison. She had been ill since adolescence, confined to her room for years, managing an extremely demanding invalid existence, all under the supervision of her father, Edward Moulton Barrett. He had a comprehensive and unyielding view of how the household should be run. In 1846 she eloped. She left Wimpole Street with Robert Browning in secret against her father's explicit wishes. The father never forgave her. The room she had compared to a prison was left behind. And what happened to her health, once she left the sick room and the restrictions behind, is instructive. She didn't entirely recover. She continued to have health problems throughout her life. She died at 55. But she was dramatically better than she had been in London. She was more active, more social, more engaged with the world, and she produced some of the most celebrated Victorian poetry in the years after she left, including sonnets from the Portuguese and Aurora Leigh, a novel in verse that sold remarkably well for its time. The work that made her famous was written after she left the room, which raises a question about what the room had actually been doing while she was in it. The question of whether her illness was primarily physical or partly strategic is complicated by her father's character. Edward Moulton Barrett was controlling to a degree historians describe as pathological. The household he ran was closed. The daughters in it were managed with the degree of oversight that left almost no room for autonomous movement. In that context, the sickroom was not just medically sanctioned rest. It was the only private space available, the only place in the house where the father's management stopped, or at least diminished. Whether the illness that put Barrett there was primarily physical or partly strategic is almost beside the point. What mattered was what the room allowed. And then there was Harriet Martineau. If you haven't encountered Martineau, she is one of the more remarkable and least well-known figures in Victorian intellectual life. She was a writer, a sociologist, an economist, a journalist, a political theorist, and an abolitionist. She was also deaf for most of her life, which gives her particular relationship with Victorian expectations of female pleasantness an additional layer of complexity. In 1839, at 37, Martineau became severely ill and moved to Tynemouth on the northeast coast of England. She remained there, bedridden, for 5 years. During those 5 years, she wrote Life in the Sickroom, published in 1844. It is the most extraordinary document of Victorian invalidism I encountered while researching this episode. It is a philosophical reflection on what the sickroom offers and what it takes and what it creates. It is thoughtful, clear-eyed, sometimes funny, and occasionally devastating. And it makes an argument I want to share with you. Martineau's argument, made from inside the sickroom, is that the invalid's perspective is not a diminished one. It is, in several specific ways, an expanded one. From the sickroom, she argues, you see society differently. You observe from the outside. The social performances that absorb healthy people, the calls, the dinners, the management of impressions, you no longer perform. And because you don't participate, you see them with a clarity that participants don't have. The sickroom, she argues, is an excellent place from which to understand the world, partly because there is so little else to do, but partly because the particular angle of vision it provides is not available anywhere else. And then there is the most famous Victorian invalid. You may not have thought of him in this light before. Charles Darwin spent most of his adult life in various states of chronic illness. He had recurring stomach problems, fatigue, heart palpitations, and extraordinary susceptibility to stress. He lived at Down House in Kent, managed his correspondence from there, and received very few visitors. He spent most of his time working in conditions of deliberately maintained calm and quiet. What was wrong with Darwin? The current leading theories include Chagas disease, contracted during his voyage on the Beagle, and a psychosomatic component produced by the anxiety of a man who knew his theory would disrupt the world and was carefully building his evidence before releasing it. Both theories are probably partially right. What is not in dispute is that his ill health gave him an excellent excuse to avoid dinners, professional meetings, and the social machinery that would have distracted him from his work. He declined invitations from his bed. He received the information he wanted and filtered out the rest. He wrote the origin of species in precisely this way, slowly, carefully, protected by his health from the demands that would otherwise have disrupted his thinking. Darwin's case complicates the story in a useful way, because the Victorian sickroom as a strategic space was not exclusively available to women. Men also used chronic ill health to manage their professional obligations and protect their working conditions. What is different, the central difference, is what they were using it to protect themselves from. Darwin was using it to protect his intellectual work. Many of the women in this story were using it to gain access to intellectual work in the first place. The same strategy, serving opposite purposes. One used it to defend freedom. The other used it to create freedom that otherwise didn't exist. What the professional invalids, the ones who used their status most effectively, seemed to understand, with varying degrees of explicitness, was something about the nature of the bargain they had struck. The sickroom gave them time, privacy, and protection from social demands. In exchange, they were required to perform invalidism convincingly enough to maintain that protection. Nightingale maintained it for 53 years. What they were performing was not deception exactly. What they were performing was the Victorian system's own logic, reflected back at it. If society believed that women's natural state was one of frailty, then frailty, deployed with intelligence, became a form of power. The sickroom was where that intelligence lived. The professional invalids, Nightingale, Barrett Browning, Martineau, Darwin, and hundreds of lesser-known figures had found something real, a way of being in the world that the Victorian system had not anticipated and couldn't easily close, because the same framework that confined women to beds also created, by its own rules, a protected space, one in which they could refuse to perform, and some of them used that protected space not to rest, but to produce. Now, the question that has been quietly hovering over this whole evening, the question of what all of this actually changed, because we've covered the strategy, the diagnosis, the medicine, and the women who turned confinement into something else. But we haven't talked about what happened, in the end, to the arrangement itself. Whether the Victorian negotiation, the strategic illness, the sickroom study, the headache that arrived on schedule, led anywhere. Whether it changed anything, whether it was ultimately a solution, or simply a workaround for a situation that required something considerably more direct. The answer, it turns out, is complicated. The Victorian negotiation accomplished something real for the specific women who used it most effectively. It created space, it created time, it created the conditions under which thinking, writing, and organising became possible for women otherwise consumed by household demands. Nightingale's bedroom was not a cage. It was, in the end, the thing that made everything else she did possible. Barrett Browning's room at Wimpole Street, whatever its costs, had protected her time to read and think. Martineau's 5 years in Teenamoth produced one of the most remarkable philosophical works of the Victorian era. The sickroom worked as a tool for the specific women who had the means and the access to deploy it. But here is what it cost. To use the sickroom as a tool, you had to be believably ill. Ill enough that the authorities around you, medical, social, domestic, accepted the premise, which meant you had to accept the diagnosis. You had to agree in public that your constitution was delicate, that the female body was prone to collapse. You had to perform the very ideology that was being used to constrain you, and to perform it convincingly for years in front of the people who could end your protection. There is a particular kind of damage that comes from agreeing for years that you are what you are not. The women who used the sickroom strategically were not in many cases genuinely fragile. They were intelligent, capable, driven people told that intelligence and drive were dangerous in a woman's body. To survive in this framework, they had to accept its terms. To accept its terms was to internalize at least partly its claims. There is a reason Victorian women's private diaries show such complicated relationships with their own minds and abilities. They had been taught to distrust the very thing they were most capable of. Even the ones who found ways around the distrust had to spend considerable energy managing it. And there is a further cost. Every successful invalid reinforced the framework. Every woman who used the sickroom to produce remarkable work also confirmed something, that women needed to be managed. That limitation was their natural state. Nightingale could not say publicly that her bedroom was a headquarters. She had to maintain the fiction that she was a fragile woman doing her best under difficult circumstances. The price of her success was, in part, perpetuating the very story that had made the success necessary. And then there is the larger cost. The women least visible in this history, the ones who didn't have the resources, the education, or the specific genius that could make the sickroom productive. The working-class woman who couldn't afford to be ill at all, the woman who genuinely collapsed under the weight of the restrictions and never found a way back. The woman whose sickroom produced not a brilliant diary, but years of wasted capacity and decline. For every Nightingale, there were hundreds of women the Victorian treatment economy simply failed. Their stories are harder to find. They left less paperwork. But they are part of this history too. The arrangement began to crack, gradually, across the last quarter of the 19th century. Women entered the medical profession in growing numbers from the 1870s onward. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain in 1865. By the 1880s, women were studying at Girton and Newnham colleges in Cambridge. Not yet allowed to take degrees, but studying the same material as the men. They were entering the civil service, the law, journalism. Each incursion into previously male-exclusive territory made the ideology of female intellectual incapacity harder to sustain. The medical ideology of female fragility was also being challenged from within medicine itself. By the 1890s, there were physicians arguing, in print, in the journals, that the rescue was counterproductive, that women's nervous complaints were produced by the conditions of their lives and not by their constitutions, that the treatment of female patients needed to change. These arguments were not yet the mainstream view, but they existed, and they were being made in the language that the medical establishment respected, the language of evidence and clinical observation. And then there was the First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, hundreds of thousands of women in Britain entered paid employment for the first time, by some estimates over 1 million. They ran farms, drove ambulances, and worked in munitions factories. In conditions the Victorian medical literature would have declared physiologically unsuitable for the female constitution. The female constitution proved perfectly adequate. The women who did this work did not suffer the nervous collapse the Victorian establishment had predicted. What they suffered from was what men suffered from: overwork, danger, grief, the specific horrors of the war. The ideology of female fragility did not survive the war in any recognizable form. Something else replaced it. It was not equality, but it was different. By 1920, the hysteria diagnosis was already shrinking in its clinical application. By 1940, it had been largely absorbed into other categories. By 1980, it was formally retired. The institutional infrastructure that had produced it was not retired on the same schedule. Some of it is still in the process of revision. But the specific Victorian negotiation was a product of a very specific historical moment. A moment when that gap was so large and so formally enforced that the only available response was oblique. The oblique response is worth understanding clearly, because it's easy, looking back, to see only the strategy, the clever workaround, the headache that arrived on cue, and it is tempting to find this admirable, which it was. But it is also worth remembering what it meant that the strategy was necessary. Every stolen hour of writing, every sickroom headquarters, every headache that arrived on schedule, these were evidence of a system that had made direct action impossible. The strategy was genuinely admirable. The system that required it was not, and yet, the women who navigated that system left something behind that outlasted the system itself. The yellow wallpaper outlasted the rest cure. The Nightingale nursing reforms outlasted Victorian ideas about female frailty. Alice James's diary outlasted everything Alice James's physician ever wrote. The work that happened in those rooms lasted. Done sideways, in margins, in stolen hours before the candle went out, it lasted. More durable in the end than the framework that had tried to prevent it. That is not a small thing. What I know is that the women in this history were navigating something genuinely difficult. They were not performing weakness. Most of them were not, at least not primarily. They were managing an extraordinary degree of constraint with whatever tools were available, and some of those tools were brilliant, and some of those tools were dangerous, and some of them worked, and in the specific, limited, imperfect way that such things work. Some of those tools changed the world. There is finally a question this history doesn't answer, and I want to be honest about that. The question of whether the individual act of resistance, the strategic headache, the sickroom study, was enough. Whether the accumulation of individual intelligent workarounds amounted to something structural. Whether Nightingale's approach produced more change than unobstructed access to the rooms of power would have done. These questions don't have clean answers. What they have are complicated ones, and complicated answers, in the quiet of a room with the lights low, are perhaps the most appropriate kind. Let's come back to where we started tonight, to the room with the candle burning low and the curtains drawn against the street, to the person lying in the quiet dark with the world suspended outside the window. The Victorians built an entire medical and social infrastructure to explain why women needed to rest. We've spent this evening on how wrong that was, but the thing they were wrong about in the end was not rest. It was who rest was for, and who had the right to decide when it was needed, and what was supposed to happen in the room where it was taking place. What the Victorian women in this story understood is that rest and production are not always opposites, that the room where everyone thought you were resting was often where your most demanding work was happening, that the invalid couch is not necessarily where work stops. Sometimes it is where work becomes possible. Rest, when it is chosen, when it is a decision rather than a prescription, is a different thing entirely. The Victorians enforced rest. They prescribed it, managed it, monitored it, medicated it, and when necessary, operated on the person being required to do it. What they produced was not recovery. What they produced in many cases was a population of women who had been told that the most natural thing they should do for themselves, think, write, engage, participate, was dangerous, who had, as a result, developed complicated relationships with their own capacity for rest and work. Here is what I keep coming back to whenever I think about the Victorian sickroom. The strategy required an extraordinary degree of self-awareness. The women who used it most effectively understood exactly what they were doing. They understood the system, its rules, and the gaps the rules created, and they operated in those gaps with a precision and a patience that I find genuinely remarkable. Not because the strategy was perfect, not because it worked for everyone, or anyone, at no cost, but because it was, under the circumstances, the most intelligent response available. And intelligence, applied to impossible circumstances, is always worth looking at. You are presumably listening to this in the dark, or in the half-dark, in the stillness that comes after the day's demands has been set down. And there is something I hope you take from this evening. Not the diagnosis, not the laudanum, not even the extraordinary women, though I hope you spend some time with them. Something simpler. The Victorians were wrong about almost everything. The cause, the mechanism, the treatment, what the person resting was actually doing. But they were not wrong that the room matters, that the quality of stillness matters, that what you do in the quiet, in the hours when the world is not watching and the demands have been temporarily suspended, that this is not nothing, that this might in fact be quite a lot. The room you're in right now has a temperature, a weight to the air, a particular quality of quiet, different from other quiets. The quiet of this specific room, at this specific hour. Notice that for a moment. Just the room, the specific quality of where you are. What the Victorian women in their sick rooms knew is that this quality of space is not nothing. That the experience of being in a quiet room, with the demands of the day at a distance, is worth having, worth protecting, worth, in their case, manufacturing from the materials the medical system had provided. You don't have to manufacture it. You're already here. The body, when given permission to rest, chosen rest, not prescribed rest, does something quite specific. The heart rate begins to slow, incrementally, in the first few minutes of deliberate stillness. The muscles held in the small, constant tensions of wakefulness begin, one by one, to release. The jaw unclenches, the shoulders lower, the breath, which has been doing the careful managed breathing of a person in a day, begins to lengthen, and deepen, and find its own pace. Your breathing has already changed. In the first few minutes of deliberate stillness, the breathing always changes, and even when you don't intend it to. The inhale gets longer, the exhale gets longer. The ratio shifts in the direction of the parasympathetic nervous system, the one responsible for rest and repair. The body, given the opportunity, defaults to recovery. This is what it wants to do. This is what it has been trained to do over millions of years of nights. Tonight's night is another in the long series. The body knows where this goes. Something in your brain has been quietly shifting since the light began to dim. A slow signal moving through the body, telling it that the day is drawing toward its close. This signal is not something you can rush. It proceeds at its own pace. What you can do is stop interfering with it. Stop looking at bright screens. Stop running the events of the day in a loop that keeps you awake and tense. Let it work. Let it settle. You're not needed for this part. This is not metaphor. This is physiology. The body has a system for this transition, and it doesn't need to be told how to run it. It has been running this system for the entire duration of your life. Approximately 35 years of nights. If you are of a certain age, each one navigated successfully, or near enough. The system is not fragile. It does not require management. What it requires, and what the Victorian sick room, for all its absurdities, was occasionally correct about, is permission. Permission to stop, permission to put the day down, not to solve it, not to determine what happened and what it meant, not to plan tomorrow, just to put it down. Here, in this room, for now. The Victorian women who used the sick room most deliberately understood something modern sleep science has since confirmed. The transition into rest is not something you force, it is something you allow. The effort to force sleep works against the physiological process. What works is the opposite of effort. What works is the deliberate removal of effort, the permission, the room, the quiet, the specific quality of this specific darkness. There is a state documented by sleep researchers that exists in the transition between waking and sleeping. It is called hypnagogia. In this state, the mind is still partially conscious, still aware of the room and the sounds, but it has begun to lose its grip on narrative coherence. The thoughts that move through it stop being connected in the way that waking thoughts connect. They become images, impressions, fragments. A candle, a room, a woman at a window, a pattern moving on a wall. The mind in hypnagogia is not quite asleep and not quite awake. It is in the particular, gentle, productive space between. Let the images come. You don't need to follow them. You don't need to make sense of them, or categorize them, or hold them in place. They'll arrive and move and go. The mind does this naturally, in the space between. You've been in this space before, many thousands of times. You know how to be here, even if you've never thought about it in these terms. The Victorian invalid, lying on her couch, had access to something she may not have been able to name. Not rest in the medical sense. Not the prescribed, monitored, managed kind. But this, the specific quality of a mind that has set down its work and has not yet picked up its dreams. The space between. Some of the best of what those women produced was thought through in this space, not while they were consciously working, while they were lying still in the productive stillness of a mind that has been given sufficiently permission. The Victorian women in their sick rooms, candles burning low, curtains drawn, were in a version of this space. They were in the particular stillness created when the world has been temporarily required to wait. Some of them were genuinely resting. Some of them were writing, or thinking, or planning. Some were in between, in the half-light of a mind that had set down the day but not yet released it. The invalid couch was not always a place of sleep, but it was almost always a place where the grip of the ordinary day had loosened. And that loosening, whether it led to sleep or to work or to something quietly both, was significant. You're in a version of that space now. The specific Victorian coordinates are different. Presumably no laudanum on the bedside table, no dispatch to write before morning. But the essential structure is the same. A room, a particular quality of quiet, the day at a distance, the body beginning, slowly and in its own time, the process of letting go. Let it let go. Whatever was in the day, whatever needs to be sorted, addressed, reconsidered, apologized for, remembered, corrected, it will still be there in the morning. These things are notably persistent. They don't require your attention tonight to continue existing. You are not their keeper, not tonight. Tonight they can wait. The room is quiet. Whatever sounds come through, traffic or wind or the settling of the building around you, they are not signals. They don't require response. They are just the sounds the world makes in its ordinary evening work. Nothing to do with you. The mind, at this stage of the evening, has a very specific texture. It is softer than it was an hour ago. The thoughts that move through it are less committed. They start without necessarily finishing. Finish in directions they didn't intend. This is normal. This is the texture of the mind in the transition zone, and it is a texture you can trust. The transition zone is not lost time. It is not wasted time. It is the specific time in which the mind does its gentlest and most necessary work. Let it do that work now. The weight of the blankets, or the duvet, or whatever covers you, that weight is right. Not too heavy, not too light. You have arranged it exactly as you prefer, in the specific way you have learned to prefer it over all the years of nights you have had. Trust that arrangement. You know this room. You know this bed. You have woken up in this room before, and you will wake up in it again. And between those two moments there is a space that belongs entirely to the body's own processes. You don't need to supervise them. They will happen without you. The candle in the Victorian sick room burned low. The invalid closed her eyes, or didn't. Sometimes the most productive moments were on the borderline, lying still with the eyes open, watching the candlelight move on the ceiling, not asleep, not quite awake, in the specific productive stillness of a mind that has set down most of its concerns. That is where you are now, on the borderline. The day is behind you, the night is ongoing, sleep is somewhere ahead, patient and unhurried. It will come in its own time, which is soon, sooner than it would come if you tried to hurry it. The history from tonight is settling now. The women, the rooms, the diagnoses, the small brown bottles on the bedside tables, into that part of the mind that processes things slowly, overnight. By morning it will have organized itself into something you didn't consciously arrange. The mind is good at this, better than we usually give it credit for. Florence Nightingale, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Alice James, Harriet Martineau, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Women who lay in rooms with the curtains drawn and found things the world had not intended for them to find. Let those names go somewhere quiet in you. You don't have to do anything with them. Now we are at the very end of the evening. There is nothing left to explain, nothing left to understand, or consider, or think through. The day is done. The history is done. Whatever remains to be thought about, it will think itself quietly and at its own pace while you sleep. All is quiet. The night is quiet. The body knows what to do. You have done this before. You know how to do this. Let it be easy. Let it be quiet. Let the weight of the duvet settle over you. Let the temperature of the room, which is already exactly right, do what it knows how to do. Sleep comes to this, not to effort, not to intention, but to this. The quiet room, the body finding its own pace, the breath settling, the mind loosening its grip on the shape of the day, one detail at a time. The Victorian sick room, in its best moments, was this, just this. Whatever else was going on, at some point the candle burned down. The woman in the room closed her eyes. The ordinary miracle of sleep arrived, as it always does, quietly, without announcement, without effort, as it will for you. Good night.